Thanks for staying with News at Prime tonight. Let's take you to one of our top stories this evening. The ANC's National Executive Committee announced a broad economic turnaround plan. It's aimed at gaining investor confidence and restoring the economy. It follows weekend talks between party leaders and alliance partners to improve the country's growth trajectory. For more on this, we're joined by political analyst Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Now, much of the critique towards the statement that was given today is that it's much of the same, nothing new. But I think maybe if we were to find silver linings before we get to everything that may be wrong with it, were there any that stood out for you?
Well, there were all things that were repeated in that statement. Things like industrialization or beneficiation, for instance, using South Africa's large reserves or deposits of mineral resources, things like copper and this and that. This is a strategy that the ANC has been talking about for a while. They talked about economic development zones, giving concessions to companies to invest in depressed areas. Those are old things, but there is a bit of newness in this, and these are some of the contentious issues that have dogged the alliance. One of them is the application of minimum wage, right? And COSATU has been wanting this, and when it was adopted, it was celebrated. But some within the ANC, I mean, Jonas in his brilliant book was saying, you know, there are areas where minimum wage would actually be a hindrance for investment or against investment. So, for instance, one of the things I was saying is that you need to spare small businesses. They need to grow. You can't place them under massive regulation. So those are the new things. And one of them also has to do with state-owned enterprises. The issue of nationalization, privatization has been dogging our politics for a while. And now they are saying, it's quite interesting, the NEC, the entire statement, says we need to think of how we make these things viable. And of course, they are not talking wholesale privatization, but selling some stakes in these companies. And they're acknowledging that some of these companies, SAA, ESCOM, some of them are not working. So what you need to do is to sell portions of those companies to private sector people who would hopefully run them effectively. So yes, old stuff, rhetoric, ANC stuff. I don't know why they had to meet to discuss the manifesto, this and that, because it would have been better if the discussion was centered largely on the controversial things that need to be done.
I want to talk then about those SOEs, because you talk about concessions, but some economic experts are actually not convinced that much of what was announced around SOEs is actually as clear as it needs to be. So even the futures of the likes of your SAAs and, you know, the talk about shutting down some SOEs that simply don't need to be functioning and that are continue to withdraw from the fiscus, that it didn't go far enough there.
Well, that's a function of policy. ANC sets broader guidelines, ANC as a party. Then it's left to the bureaucrats, government, to thresh out the details of policy. So I guess one can interpret that to mean there's a broader mandate to restructure. And of course, even when you go into details, there will still be contestation, but generally a marching order has been given that do restructure, work out the details, and let's talk about it later.
So how much of a green light does this effectively give Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, who we know seem to have a tenuous relationship sometimes with some of the members of the ANC, especially around how he goes about making policy pronouncement. But today, to see him there and, you know, taking the central stage really in part of these announcements. So does this mean effectively the entire alliance has said you can go ahead and implement your economic reform plan?
Our economy is in a crisis, right? Even a retarded person would have appreciated that something drastic needed to be done. So they can't, certain policies most certainly COSATU would oppose. things like privatization, for instance, not applying minimum wage in certain sectors because, those are things that are close to workers. So obviously they are going to be resisted. But there's a general consensus that certain things have got to be done. So Mboweni has been given the green light to do these things. I don't think, though, there's unanimity, absolute unanimity across the alliance that these things have to be done. And for me, the test will come when the impact of these changes are felt, when they're talking retrenchment, when they're talking numbers, right? 2,000, 3,000, and people start realizing the severity that families, so many families. So you will have contestation. And the worry for me is whether or not they will have the guts to see the reforms through, because you will have strikes, massive strikes, right? And COSATU and the SACP are ardent supporters of this president, a president who has a tenuous hold over the ANC. He's been bending backwards, pacifying or placating them because he knows that they are his hardest backers in the ANC. So when they launch into these massive strikes, will he still have the guts to carry through with the reforms? For me, that's the concern. I don't doubt Mboweni. Mboweni doesn't give a damn. He will tell them where to get off. He believes in what he does. And conviction is very important. You shouldn't do things just because you want to send gestures. He believes that these things have to happen. Does the president believe? If he does, will he go the whole way when there is pressure?
So it comes then also when, as we heard from the finance minister, Mr. Mboweni, earlier, when he was speaking about how people need to effectively pay for services. He's brought up the issue of the Soweto electricity bill. He's brought up e-tolls. But we also know that in the next 2 years, they're going to be faced with local municipal elections, which then means that effectively part of what they're talking about now will have a direct impact on the kind of councils they're able to take over in those elections. So how much then of the reform practically do you think they'd be able to implement, which will still allow them to pursue their interests as a political party?
If history is anything to go by, then I'm not optimistic that they will push through with that promise. In 1995, they had what they called Masakane campaign to get people to start paying rents and services, because previously during apartheid, people were not paying. And the response was that, well, let's see changes first. Let's see tarred roads, let's see water, then we'll start paying. And those things did come. Then there was another excuse that, well, asna mali, we don't have money, we can't pay. And politicians have always been making excuses on behalf of people who don't pay. You know what is happening now is that Eskom loses billions and billions of rands from stolen electricity. And there are people who can afford, but simply don't want to do that, don't want to pay. They are leeching off the state. They are connecting illegally. So there are certain, we have to appreciate the fact that our treasury is not collecting enough money. This state is about to be bankrupt. And we need to tighten our belts and ensure that everyone who can pay does pay. But politicians have been making excuses on behalf of people who can pay. They don't want to alienate them. They are always looking for votes. Right? You're quite right. You're quite right. Very perceptive. We have local government elections coming very soon. The ANC has lost all 3 metros here in Gauteng. Will they risk? Will they go after people for not paying? So I don't know.
Let's talk then about Eskom, because it's also one of the contentious issues. There's talk about Eskom, of course, selling off some of its assets, called the coal-fired power stations. And again, today's statement not really venturing too far into some of those controversial and treacherous waters. COSATU has already been vocal about the fact that they don't want to see restructuring at Eskom, unbundling, or any potential job losses. How much of head-on confrontation is that going to be, again, as Minister Mboweni tries to, cut out the fat, as it were?
There is definitely going to be confrontation. Reforms will happen. There will be pain somewhere down the road. And I mean, I was saying elsewhere earlier, at a place familiar to you in your previous life, that for the ANC to do the things that are necessary to be done, they have to risk losing power. Because they are going to alienate traditional allies. But then, and President Ramaphosa has started off as a public leader who was not just trying to address ANC problems. Previous ANC leaders have been organizational leaders. He's been a public leader, right? Even his campaign, he would address publicly people beyond the ANC constituency. So he needs to prioritize the public, not so much the ANC. Because the ANC's prospects of re-election lies in its resonance, in its popularity with the rest of society.
But given the fact that society itself is not exempt from those job cuts, these are the very same people whose families are going to be losing jobs, they will be losing income. And so to the extent that even the full impact of these reforms are not necessarily confined to those who are ANC members, how does he begin to confront the conundrum? Because ultimately, we've seen how the ANC has responded, just being close to being on the precipice of losing power. Do you think that it's a gamble that they'll be willing to take, even if it is in the best interest of the country?
These are trade-offs that will pay off in the long term. Let's look at Eskom. Eskom is in trouble now, and it threatens electricity supply. If you don't have electricity, companies won't function. So you might need to cut off 2,000, 3,000 people to make Eskom efficient, supply electricity efficiently, so the shops and the companies and everything else will be able to run. And when they run, they employ people, they produce more. So these are trade-offs. It's just that these things are inefficient, and you don't just keep them because they happen to employ people. Their purpose is not so much to employ people, but to provide goods and services. And those goods and services have an impact in the entire economy. So there might be inconveniences or pain here and there, but overall, if the reforms are made in a well thought out way, connected to each economy, the side effects and everything else thought through, then yes, you might have layoffs initially, but later on the economy will pick up. That's really how you need to think about this thing. It's not going to be pretty, of course, it's never pretty. But long term, you are likely to make benefits.
All right, we've run out of time for our conversation. I was hoping to also get a little bit out of you with regard to what's happening in the opposition party. But oh, okay. So I'm going to ask you to hang on then. Hang on 2 seconds for me. After the break, we're going to be in conversation with the Institute for Race Relations. We're going to be asking them about that article that has been written endorsing Alan Winde, the Western Cape Premier, as the next Democratic Alliance leader. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana is going to stay with us, and we'll bring you more of that conversation after this. You're live on News at Prime. Well, let's take you now to one of the stories we're watching for you tonight. The South African Institute for Race Relations is throwing its weight behind Western Cape Premier Alan Winde to bring in wings of change in the Democratic Alliance. Well, let's talk further about this. I'm joined by the IRR analyst writer, Hermann Pretorius. He's, of course, written that article that has gained quite a lot of attraction and staying with us for that conversation. Thank you so much again for your time, political analyst, Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana. Herman, let me begin with you. There's been quite a strong response to the article that you've written, and many are questioning, firstly, whether or not it's your place, specifically as a think tank, to be making such pronouncements, to be taking the stance. What informed the decision to go ahead and endorse Alan Winde, and speak to us about the fundraising aspect too?
Right. I think the first thing that I have to make clear is that this was an opinion piece that I wrote. I'm employed by the Institute of Race Relations, and I absolutely adore working there, and they seem to be happy with me so far. But I'm not. This wasn't an IRR position. This was my own personal opinion, my own personal opinion piece. So if someone has to stand behind that, it should be me, and perhaps not my colleagues. So, with regards to whether this is our place, the IRR, we've been in a classical liberal think tank for 90 years, and The National Party didn't like it when we said they shouldn't be, race nationalists. The ANC regularly doesn't like it when we say they should now not be race nationalists. So I think for the DA to somehow argue that it is immune from think tank criticism, especially a think tank that has a century behind it of trying to influence public debate and public policy, I think that's a bit of special pleading. And, it's quite interesting, the fact that this opinion piece by Little Old Me has set off this chain explosion of reaction. I think it just goes to show in what state the party is in, and what sad state the party is in. This isn't the reaction of a party secure in its position and certain of what it wants.
Most people, certainly the impression that you get when you look at some of the responses from the DA leaders, I'm going to ask our team just to pull up the conversation, at least that's been happening on social media, is that many seem to not trust the intentions of the IRR. They believe that you are actually now part of wanting to campaign and wanting to influence party goings on within the Democratic Alliance, but from the part of the institution which you're using as a guise for all of this.
Again, it's an opinion piece by a relatively junior analyst. It's quite jarring that the chief whip of the official opposition of the Republic of South Africa in cabinet finds it in himself to engage with me. I'm very flattered, of course, but this really has gone much, much, much further than I intended. At the Institute, we are encouraged to think for ourselves, to have constructive debate. One of my colleagues, Helen Ziller, of course, I don't think she's 100% in chime with the case I'm making. But, we're not a political party. We don't speak with one voice. We speak based on the principles of classical liberalism, limited government, free market economics, treating the individual as a human being before associating them with some race group. So I think it's very entertaining, at least, to think that I am somehow, the mastermind behind a coup in the direction.
Certainly not the mastermind, but in some ways the mouthpiece. Professor Ndletyana, are the intentions as noble as Hermann here is painting them out for us tonight?
Well, it may well be that Hermann believes in what he says, and I'm quite certain that he's not the only one who holds that view in the DA. Because issues of race in the DA have always been very contentious. Part of the reason why Tony Leon resigned, for instance, was because Ryan Coetzee, who was the strategist at the time, wrote a report saying, we've reached the glass ceiling now within the white electorate. For us to be a formidable opposition, even a credible challenger to the ANC, we need to go beyond the white electorate to attract black folks. So for that to happen, we need to be sensitive to issues that impact on black people and possibly change leadership. That's what Ryan Coetzee wrote. Leon writes about it in his biography. So they weren't looking for a leader that would be acceptable, right? Leon wanted the Eastern Cape former leader, Trollip. But it happened that Helen Zille, at the time, the Western Cape was the largest support base for the DA. So it made sense to make Helen the leader. And she spoke a little bit of Xhosa and had struggle credentials. So the idea was to find a leader who would resonate somewhat with the broader black constituency. And Helen made some changes, but she got stuck when it came to issues of equity. And this is where she had a lot of fights with Lindiwe Mazibuko, for instance. At some point, Lindiwe wanted Parliament to pass or made an input from the DA perspective on issues of equity, supporting equity. And Helen, who was premier at the time and leader of the party, opposed her quite vehemently. That's where the split happened between the two. So the issue of race, and the major concern there was that if you support issues like affirmative action, you run the risk of losing your own traditional support base. Yes, it might appeal to others, but your traditional base, you might alienate them. And what has been happening, unfortunately, is that the wide traditional support base of the party is uncomfortable.
But this is a party that prides itself on being non-racial. And it's one of the things that Hermann also raises in his piece. So does that mean that there is perhaps not a full agreement within the Democratic Alliance about issues of race, issues of identity politics, and the extent to which even things such as affirmative action can and should be supported?
To say in South Africa race doesn't matter is to delude oneself, really. It's not a serious view, because the entire history of South Africa has been shaped by race. There are people who tell you that they cannot get jobs in certain companies because they are black. They cannot get residence in certain apartments. When you call and you're sounding like Cathy, like the North in Limpopo somewhere, they would tell you that there is no place here, but when your white colleague calls, they will say, yes, there is a place. So there is racial discrimination. There are inequalities that have been shaped primarily by race. So what we are talking about is redress. The dispute could be, how far do we take that redress? For how long? So to say that race doesn't matter, to say racism doesn't matter is really to fake ignorance.
I think Hermann might slightly disagree with you, maybe not on racism, but certainly on race, because he says, according to their studies, they've actually shown that the majority of South Africans want people who are able to deliver, regardless of whether or not they're black or white.
Absolutely. It's very interesting that the professor raises the point of inequality. One of the specific questions in the polling we did at the end of last year and published this year in one of our Reasons for Hope reports is this question of what do you think is the solution to this inequality caused by our racial past? What is the step going forward? And 3/4 of South Africans, all South Africans, say, 76%, say the way forward is better education and jobs. Those are non-racial issues if we are going to be completely honest. We all want a thriving economy. We all want good schools. And of course, our history is you know, it's tainted by this permanent racism that has dominated government policy for a century. But the problem is that going back to what happened in 1999, I think the DP then made a fundamental miscalculation. It wasn't that the white voters moved away from the National Party, or the new National Party it then was, and the ANC towards the DP, because they were white. They moved away because they were the easiest voters to disconnect from the very strong currents of liberation politics. It wasn't a racial shift, it was an ideological shift that happened to align closely with race. If we look at the polling we do, more than 80% of South Africans say they don't care what the skin color of their teacher is.
But that very polling has now been brought under question because, of course, I think even before this instance, there were questions around the extent to which much of your work, whether or not it's done to simply support liberal policy. And after this opinion piece today, there seems to be a sentiment that in itself might be biased simply because you've come out so strongly on a position around politics.
You know, the problem is that our work for 90 years has stood or has fallen on the integrity of our data and the integrity of our analysis. And there are things which, for example, gay rights in South Africa, a largely conservative, small c conservative country, a traditionalist continent, Africa being, gay rights doesn't have broad electoral support. And yet we publish the opinion polling saying, a large chunk of South Africans might not think gay rights is an issue, but we at the Institute, we insist it is. This is part of freedom. So the idea that our polls are skewed, that's a very easy aspersion to make, but show us where our methodology is wrong. You can't dismiss a poll because you disagree with it. And I see the professor wants to come in here.
He's burning to jump in there.
Let me add just one thing about our polling on race relations. Here we are sitting, a black man, a black woman, a white man, and I have no antagonism towards you, and neither in this direction, and the same here. Our daily existence as South Africans shows the deep humanity, the common sense, the common decency that we really hold dear. South Africans aren't, you know, the race-obsessed Twitter trolls that many people in politics and journalism think we are.
Prof, we're going to give you a chance to come in.
Yeah, well, the fact that we're sitting here smiling at each other doesn't mean racism doesn't exist.
Not what I'm saying. Not what I'm saying at all, sir.
If you have a poll that says you asked what are the most important things and we get told employment and education, those two things do not necessarily mean on their own that race doesn't matter.
No, that's not what the poll said.
If you ask a question, let me finish the point.
Yeah, I think you misunderstood my point, sir.
Can I just make the point? If you ask someone in the same view, in the same survey, and say, do you think that affirmative action doesn't matter? Do you think that racism doesn't matter?
We have polling on that.
Do you think race continues to influence your life opportunities in South Africa? You would get a resounding yes. So there are specific questions. Paul, it depends on what question you asked. I'm not questioning the credibility of the institute, right? But if you set out looking for certain things, you might ask certain questions and omit others. But to say because, you know, people get along, yes, people get along. Generally, people are decent, right? But for certain opportunities that people go for, where they are now and their future prospects, those things are determined by race. If you look at sport, if you look at rugby, some management, coaches, you know, had to be forced to bring in black people.
Can I honestly come in at this point?
So can I just finish the point?
Just a moment, Herman.
To say that the racial issues do not matter is to really to be dishonest about South African history. Because the other polls will tell you the same thing. People's experience will tell you that these things matter. We can argue about the extent to which they exist. Right? Yes, that's an honest debate, but to deny them out of existence is really to be dishonest.
Herman?
Thank goodness by that criteria we're not dishonest, because we don't deny their existence. We did polling on sport quotas. 84% of South Africans support choosing sports teams on merit, not on race quotas. If the professor has a problem with that data, show the error in the data. He can't come with anecdotal evidence and say, oh, this happened at this instance. The professor should know. If you're going to do analysis, you do it on data, not an anecdote. So if we're going to look at the polling, what are the priorities of South Africans? 26% of respondents said it is the creation of jobs, unemployment, with 1% of respondents saying affirmative action should be sped up. That's the top priority of government. Now, to think that anyone can legitimately say racism doesn't matter in South Africa or race doesn't matter, that is to fundamentally have a different discussion. And the professor is welcome to have that. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that what he says we are saying, we are actually saying. We are saying South Africans are a common sense people. We are saying we are not going to insult voters by saying you make your mark on the ballot box based on whether the face there matches your own. We are saying if a police officer is going to help you as a South African, you're not going to care whether he's white, black or coloured. And if a politician can create 500,000 jobs, as Mr. Winde has in the Western Cape, go show me one of those 500,000 South Africans who say, I don't want this job, it was created for me.
I'm going to have to come
politician.
in here because I also want to show you then this clip that was a little bit earlier on, Mohlahlana of the DA, and a lot of the DA's leaders seem to have been triggered by your comments, and many are actually asking themselves why it is that you have gone out to, you know, write the article in the way that you have and say the things you have said. So if we can just play that bite, if we can just play the bite of Mohlahlana from a little bit earlier on in the day with my colleague Tulasizwe Simelane, that's what he had to say.
The opinion piece that the IRR is punting out there is actually nonsense. I've said it so. If the IRR wants to play politics, they must register a political party and contest elections. They must not use the DA to raise funds. I've said that in public, so I will not even go further to discuss that particular article by Hermann. I think I can discuss the DA, what we are doing as a DA now, than entertain that baseless nonsense that the IRR did.
Well, isn't it fascinating that he doesn't even bother to engage with the substance of my argument? He says, oh, if this is an argument you want to have, become a political party. No, we've been a successful think tank for 90 years. I'm sorry, Mr. Ghana, but we oppose the National Party when they try to implement apartheid. We oppose the ANC when they try to implement racial policy. Just because we are part of the political discussion doesn't mean we can only criticize this party if we are politicians ourselves. It's dishonest, it's a cop-out, it's a weak reaction from a party clearly that should be in a better state than reacting in such a way to an opinion piece by a relatively junior analyst. It's reflecting the weak state of the party.
All right, I'm going to give you the final word here.
Part of the reason why the DA hasn't managed to attract black voters is because the election of a black leader was tokenism. It was not followed by substantive policy reforms, especially around issues of equity and race. Because they matter, black people did not flow into the DA in large numbers because these racial issues do matter. So this stance is actually, it's a surrender that we have given up. We won't ever win black votes, but it's not accompanied by an honest admission that the change in leadership was not supported by a similar substantive change in policy. It was tokenism. So they're pretty much going back to where they were, and they never even made a serious attempt. There were debates within the party, especially on welfare issues, social democracy, but there was a lot of resistance within, saying, no, free market, race doesn't matter. So the alternative view was defeated, and it's pretty much going back. And with going back, it's a surrender of black votes and any attempts at diversity. Yes, they can rhetoric. Hermann is very eloquent. He will say all sorts of things. He'll come up with his own data. He'll create his own data.
Come up with my own data.
It,
well,
right?
At least I've presented data, sir. I've seen nothing but anecdote.
They will not win. They will not get any far with black votes because they remain pretty much in a racial cocoon as a party of racial privilege.
The assumption that black South Africans can only vote for a black politician is, I think, frankly insulting.
All right, we're going to leave it there on that note for tonight. Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana and Hermann Pretorius, he's with the Institute for Race Relations, and of course writing that article that has had lots of South Africans talking. As you hear, it's a contentious issue. I'll tell you what, we're probably expecting to hear more from within the Democratic Alliance.